Chun Doo-hwan, Tyranny in the Name of Order, Part 1, Roots of Power, Chun Doo-hwan's formative years amidst war, poverty, and ambition. The story of Chun Doo-hwan, one of South Korea's most consequential and divisive figures, begins not in the halls of government or on the military parade ground, but in a modest farming village in Korea's southern countryside during a time of colonial domination. Chun was born on January 18, 1931, in Yulgok-myeon, a rural community within Hapcheon County in South Gyeongsang Province. At the time, the entire Korean peninsula was under the yoke of Japanese imperial rule, having been annexed by Japan in 1910. Chun's birthplace was part of the colonial entity known as the Empire of Japan, and his early childhood was spent in the shadow of that occupation. Chun's family belonged to the Wonsanjeon clan, a lineage rooted in Korea's ancient traditions, but one that offered little in terms of wealth or social advantage. His father, Jeon Sang-woo, and mother, Kim Jong-mun, raised 10 children in conditions of relative poverty. Chun was the fourth son, though tragedy marked his early years when his two eldest brothers, Yeol-hwan and Gyugon, died in an accident during his infancy. This early brush with loss would become a defining theme in Chun's life, a pattern of resilience amid adversity that carried over into his later ambitions and outlook. Chun's father was a man of strong will, but his actions often skirted the boundaries of colonial law. Jeon Sang-woo had already come into conflict with the Japanese Kempeitai, the feared military police, long before 1939. That year, his personal vendetta against a local Japanese-appointed police captain culminated in a brutal act of violence, the murder of the officer during the winter months. With his father now a fugitive and his family facing imminent retribution from the colonial authorities, Chun, still a child, was swept into a life-altering escape. The family fled Korea and went into hiding in Jilin, Manchukuo, a puppet state set up by Japan in northeast China. They remained there in exile for nearly 2 years, avoiding detection while trying to survive in unfamiliar and precarious circumstances. The experience left a profound psychological imprint on Chun. As a boy forced to hide from armed authorities, his early sense of safety and normalcy was shattered. Living in fear, far from home, and burdened by the knowledge that his father had murdered a symbol of colonial authority, Chun likely came to view power not as something benevolent, but as something dangerous and elusive, something one must seize and guard with unwavering control. When the family returned to Korea in the early 1940s, Chun was already years behind his peers in school. Though he resumed his elementary education at Horan Elementary School in Daegu, he was academically delayed and socially dislocated. Despite these setbacks, Chun exhibited a determined and disciplined demeanor, traits that would define his character for the rest of his life. His move to Daegu, a city experiencing rapid modernization, marked a transition from rural obscurity to a world of more dynamic influences and broader horizons. In 1947, he entered Daegu Vocational Middle School, located some 25 kilometers from his home. The commute was long and grueling, sometimes requiring him to walk extensive distances or lodge temporarily with acquaintances closer to the school. Yet Chun persevered, showing an unflinching determination to advance himself through education. Later, he enrolled in Daegu Vocational High School, where he began to distinguish himself as a serious, self-controlled student with an emerging sense of authority. This period of Chun's life coincided with one of Korea's most turbulent transitions. Following the end of Japanese colonial rule in 1945, Korea became a divided land, split by Cold War tensions into a Soviet-backed North and an American-supported South. Political turmoil, economic instability, and ideological battles raged across the peninsula. Then in June 1950, the Korean War erupted when the North Korean army invaded the South. Chun, who was just 19 at the time, joined the conflict as part of the Student Volunteer Forces, a national call that mobilized thousands of young men to fight for the defense of the fledgling Republic of Korea. The Korean War proved to be a crucible for Chun. Unlike many of his classmates, who either died in battle or returned traumatized, Chun emerged hardened, resolute, and resolutely devoted to military service. He developed an unshakable belief in the necessity of discipline, hierarchy, and the absolute authority of command. The suffering he witnessed during the war, the death of comrades, the chaos of civilian displacement, the disintegration of civil society, would later serve as a justification for his own iron-fisted governance. He internalized the conviction that only a strong, centralized authority could preserve order in Korea. It was during this turbulent era that Chun decided to formalize his military career. In 1951, while the war was still raging, he applied to and was admitted into the Korea Military Academy, KMA, an elite institution modeled after West Point and tasked with producing the future officer corps of the South Korean Army. Chun entered the KMA's 11th class, joining a cohort of young men who, like him, had been molded by war and were committed to rebuilding their country through the military. The Korea Military Academy was where Chun began forging the personal network that would later become the cornerstone of his rise to power. His classmates, many of whom would go on to become generals, commanders, and intelligence officers, became part of an informal brotherhood. This inner circle of KMA graduates, especially those from Chun's 11th class, would eventually form Hanaho, a powerful military faction that operated in secret and laid the groundwork for Chun's eventual coup. At the KMA, Chun was not necessarily the most brilliant student, but he was dependable, forceful, and utterly committed to discipline. He stood out for his calm under pressure, his ability to command loyalty, and his sense of purpose. These traits earned him the attention of senior officers and instructors, several of whom would go on to mentor and support him throughout his career. In 1955, Chun graduated from the KMA with a Bachelor of Science degree and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. His military career was now officially underway, and the young man from Yulguk-myeon, who had once lagged behind in school and hidden from the police, was now an officer in the South Korean Army. He had transformed himself from an obscure child of rural hardship into a member of Korea's rising military elite. But Chun's ambitions extended beyond rank. He saw the army not just as a profession, but as a vehicle to power. And in post-war South Korea, where the state was fragile and political leadership was unstable, the military offered the surest path to influence and control. Thus began Chun Doo-hwan's journey into the heart of power, a journey that would take him from the muddy battlefields of the Korean War to the commanding heights of the South Korean presidency, and ultimately to disgrace, trial, and the cold verdict of history. Part 2, the rise through the ranks, military career, and the road to influence. Following his graduation from the Korea Military Academy in 1955 as a second lieutenant, Chun Doo-hwan entered a military institution that was undergoing rapid transformation. The Republic of Korea Army, still reeling from the devastation of the Korean War, was in the process of professionalizing its officer corps, and officers like Chun, young, tested by war, loyal to the state, were highly valued. From the outset, Chun demonstrated a steely commitment to discipline, hierarchy, and command responsibility, all qualities that earned him recognition from his superiors and the trust of his peers. The post-war years were marked by internal rebuilding and constant alertness. North Korea remained a looming threat, and political instability haunted the South. In this tense atmosphere, Chun began his ascent. His early postings exposed him to a range of critical experiences: command at the field level, exposure to special warfare units, and deepening contacts within the Army's upper echelons. What distinguished Chun was not just his competence in military matters, but also his knack for cultivating relationships, especially with fellow members of the KMA's 11th graduating class, many of whom would later become his trusted allies. His career advanced steadily. In the early 1960s, Chun played a visible role in the May 16, 1961 military coup orchestrated by Major General Park Chung Hee. Though Chun was only a young officer at the time, a captain, he helped organize and stage a demonstration at the KMA in support of the coup. That demonstration signaled his allegiance to the rising power in Korean politics, Park Chung Hee, whose authoritarian rule would define an entire era. Chun's loyalty was rewarded almost immediately. He was promoted to major in 1962, a relatively rapid advancement, and was appointed secretary to the commander of the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction, the ruling military junta under Park. That appointment gave Chun his first taste of real political power. As a secretary to the junta's commander, Chun was effectively embedded within the regime. He gained insight into how military authority could be used to shape national policy, and he began to learn the inner workings of state security. From 1962 onward, he navigated between roles in both field command and military administration. As Deputy Chief of Operations for the Special Warfare Command, Chun oversaw battle planning and strategic operations. His experience in that role would later prove crucial when he mobilized troops for his own seizure of power. By the mid-1960s, Chun's influence extended into the world of intelligence. In 1963, he was appointed personnel director at the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA, South Korea's powerful and secretive intelligence body. This position gave Chun access to dossiers on thousands of citizens and fellow officers. He also learned how to manipulate information, intimidate rivals, and control narratives, a skill that would serve him with terrifying efficiency in years to come. Chun continued to climb. In 1969, he was named senior advisor to the Army Chief of Staff. That role solidified his place among the Army's strategic planners and decision-makers. He began to accumulate a reputation not just as a loyal officer, but as a cunning and politically astute figure, one who could be trusted to safeguard the interests of the ruling regime. Then in 1970, Chun took on one of the most formative roles of his career, commander of the 29th Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division. This posting took him to Vietnam, where South Korea had deployed over 300,000 troops in support of the American war effort. Chun's service in Vietnam was significant. Though there is little public record of his personal combat experience, commanding a regiment in an active war zone taught him operational logistics, counterinsurgency tactics, and how to maintain morale in high-pressure environments. More importantly, it marked him as a veteran of a major international conflict, something that carried weight within South Korea's officer class. Upon his return to Korea in 1971, Chun was appointed commander of the 1st Special Forces Brigade Airborne. Special Forces were among the most elite units in the Korean military, and Chun's appointment there was both an honor and a recognition of his leadership. In 1975, he was promoted to brigadier general, and by 1976, he had become deputy chief of the Presidential Security Service, a role that placed him physically and politically close to President Park Chung Hee. It was during this period that Chun began to attract the direct favor of Park himself. According to reports in the New York Times, Park treated Chun almost like a godson, granting him rapid promotions and entrusting him with sensitive tasks. This proximity to the president gave Chun insider access to the machinery of authoritarian power, from surveillance operations to internal purges. It also emboldened him. Though Park was the undisputed leader, Chun began to believe that he too might one day command such authority. In 1978, Chun was promoted to Major General and took command of the 1st Infantry Division, one of the most powerful and prestigious divisions in the Army. As the commanding officer, Chun demonstrated his ability to maintain strict discipline and operational readiness. But more than that, he used the role to deepen his ties with other rising officers, many of whom were part of his secret faction, Hanaho. Hanaho, meaning Group of One, was an informal, clandestine organization made up primarily of KMA graduates from Chun's class. It included Roh Tae-woo and other figures who would later be instrumental in Chun's seizure of power. Though it was highly irregular, perhaps even illegal, for such a clique to exist within the rigid hierarchy of the military, Hanaho flourished. It became a mutual support network, a mechanism for consolidating influence, and eventually a shadow government within the armed forces. Its existence remained largely hidden from the public and even many within the military establishment, but it was understood at the highest levels that Chun was its leader. In 1979, Chun reached the peak of his military career when he was appointed commander of the Defense Security Command, DSC. This organization, responsible for military intelligence and internal surveillance, gave Chun unprecedented power. As head of the DSC, he controlled the monitoring of military officers, politicians, and even civilians deemed threatening to national security. In essence, he became the central nervous system of the military state, a position that allowed him to act swiftly, decisively, and with little oversight. The appointment came at a crucial time. President Park's long rule was beginning to show cracks, with increasing dissent among civilians and discomfort even within military ranks. South Korea was a nation under strain, economically ambitious but politically repressive. Into this volatile environment stepped Chun Doo-hwan, now a general with his own private network, control of the military's surveillance apparatus, and the personal trust of the aging president. But fate soon intervened. On October 26, 1979, President Park Chung Hee was assassinated by his own KCIA director, Kim Jae-kyu. The assassination plunged the country into chaos. A power vacuum emerged, and the constitutional succession process was suddenly thrown into question. In the confusion that followed, it would be Chun, strategic, ruthless, and deeply embedded in the military structure, who would emerge as the real power behind the scenes. But that would require one final step, a bold, unlawful move that would turn Chun Doo-hwan from a general into a dictator. Part 3, Seizing the Republic. The 12-12 coup and the rise of a shadow ruler. The twilight of 1979 marked one of the most dramatic turning points in modern Korean history. On the evening of October 26, the strongman President Park Chung Hee was assassinated at a private dinner party by Kim Jae-kyu, the director of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA. The act, both shocking and perplexing, sent political shockwaves across the nation. For nearly 2 decades, Park had ruled South Korea with an iron grip, overseeing rapid industrialization while suppressing political dissent with military force. With his sudden death, a power vacuum emerged, one that Chun Doo-hwan, the calculating commander of the Defense Security Command, was uniquely positioned to exploit. At the time of the assassination, the nation was thrown into confusion. Constitutional procedures dictated that Prime Minister Choi Kyu-ha assumed the role of acting president, but Choi lacked a firm political base or military support. In the eyes of the military hierarchy, he was a caretaker, not a leader. Many believed he would be unable to preserve stability or prevent civil unrest. In this fragile atmosphere, Chun, who commanded the military's internal intelligence and surveillance apparatus, saw a historic opportunity to act. On October 27, the day after the assassination, Chun moved swiftly. He convinced the new acting president and the Army Chief of Staff, General Jung Sung-hwa, to allow the Defense Security Command to lead the investigation into Park's murder. Under the guise of restoring order and identifying conspirators, Chun quietly extended his reach into all branches of national intelligence. That very day, he summoned 4 of the country's most powerful intelligence officials to his office: the deputy chiefs of foreign and domestic intelligence at the KCIA, the Attorney General, and the Chief of National Police. They were disarmed at the door, then informed of a stunning new order. Henceforth, all intelligence agencies would report directly to Chun under the newly created Joint Investigation Headquarters. This maneuver, cloaked in legalism and national security rhetoric, effectively made Chun the gatekeeper of all classified information. He could decide what was known, who was arrested, and what was kept from the public. It was an extraordinary consolidation of power executed in total silence. While Chun remained publicly subordinate to Jung Sung-hwa and other formal authorities, he was now the puppet master behind the curtain. Chun's next move came on November 5, 1979, when he publicly announced that the full responsibility for Park's assassination rested solely with Kim Jae-kyu and his close associates. By releasing this preliminary report, Chun closed off alternative narratives and preempted rival factions within the government and military from challenging his version of events. But control of intelligence was not enough. Chun knew that to secure permanent authority, he had to control the army itself. That meant removing General Jung, a respected officer who still nominally commanded the military. Chun began to organize his inner circle, the Hanaho faction. These officers, many of them fellow graduates of the 11th class of the Korea Military Academy, were fiercely loyal to Chun and shared his belief that South Korea could not afford another period of civilian-led instability. Their chance came on December 12, 1979. Under the pretense that General Jong had conspired with Kim Jae-kyu in the assassination of President Park, Chun issued an unauthorized order to arrest him. On the night of December 12th, Chun mobilized troops loyal to him, units from the 29th Regiment, the 9th Infantry Division, and the 1st and 3rd Airborne Brigades. These units entered Seoul under cover of night and converged on military command centers. The capital became a silent battlefield. Commander Jang Tae-wan of the Capital Garrison Command and General Jong Byung-ju of the Special Forces attempted to resist the coup. In the process, Major Kim Oh-rang, an aide-de-camp to Jong Byung-ju, was killed in a brief gunfight. By dawn on December 13, Chun's forces had successfully seized the Ministry of National Defense and Army headquarters. General Jong was under arrest. With nearly all opposition silenced and the military high command in disarray, Chun had, without firing more than a few shots, executed a near-bloodless coup. Though he did not yet hold a formal political title, he was, in effect, the de facto ruler of South Korea. The 12/12 coup marked a defining moment. It was not just a military action, it was the birth of a regime. South Korea's brief experiment with post-Park civilian governance was extinguished in a single night. Chun and his Hanaho faction now held unchallenged control over the military, the intelligence services, and the instruments of state violence. In early 1980, Chun was promoted to lieutenant general and appointed acting director of the KCIA, further reinforcing his dominance. On April 14th, he was formally confirmed in this role. He now held all the tools of autocracy, control of the army, the intelligence community, and the national security infrastructure. But Chun knew his position was not yet secure. Many in the public still viewed him as a behind-the-scenes manipulator. The National Assembly, civilian politicians, student movements, and religious leaders all demanded democratic reforms and transparency in the post-Park era. For Chun, these demands represented a dangerous threat to his emerging authority. He had no intention of allowing the country to return to civilian rule, not when he had come so far. Thus, as the spring of 1980 unfolded, Chun prepared for his most decisive act yet, the declaration of full martial law, the dissolution of political institutions, and the suppression of dissent through force. This would culminate in one of the darkest chapters in South Korea's modern history, the Gwangju uprising. But before that, Chun had to eliminate the final remnants of civilian resistance. He had not merely launched a coup, he had begun a process of full authoritarian consolidation, and he would go to brutal lengths to complete it. Part 4, Martial Law and Massacre, The Path to Gwangju's Tragedy. By the spring of 1980, Chun Doo-hwan stood at a crossroads. The 12/12 coup had granted him effective control over South Korea's military and intelligence apparatus, but it had not secured him the presidency, nor silenced the country's growing hunger for democratization. The death of Park Chung Hee, while initially destabilizing, had awakened a public that had long been kept quiet under authoritarian rule. University students, religious leaders, journalists, and a small but determined political opposition called for reform. Demonstrations grew across campuses and cities, especially in the southern provinces. Chun saw in these protests not a movement for freedom, but a direct challenge to his authority, and one he would not tolerate. In May 1980, Chun launched the next phase of his seizure of power, the complete militarization of South Korean society under the pretext of national emergency. On May 17th, in an orchestrated display of force, Chun convened a meeting of military leaders and announced the expansion of martial law to the entire country. Under this decree, all universities were closed, political activity was banned, and the press was subjected to extreme censorship. The National Assembly was forcibly dissolved. At the same time, Chun ordered the arrest of hundreds of political figures, including Kim Dae-jung, a popular dissident politician who had already endured years of persecution under Park Chung Hee. The KCIA, now under Chun's control, spread disinformation that the country faced imminent communist infiltration from North Korea and was rife with domestic subversives, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that justified emergency action. This sweeping martial law transformed South Korea into a military state overnight. Army divisions were dispatched to urban centers across the country. Troops armed with rifles, tear gas, batons, and tanks flooded Seoul, Busan, Daegu, and other major cities. The atmosphere was tense, uncertain, and teetering on the edge of violence. Chun had crossed the Rubicon. Any pretense of civilian oversight or democratic transition had been swept away. What remained was the will of a single man backed by the machinery of repression. The most severe resistance to this clampdown emerged not in Seoul, but in the southwestern city of Gwangju. Historically marginalized by the central government and associated with liberal opposition movements, Gwangju had long been a bastion of anti-authoritarian sentiment. When martial law forces arrived in Gwangju on May 18th, they were met not with passive acquiescence but with fury. Students from Cheonam National University began protesting the closure of their school and the detention of Kim Dae-jung, who was born in the nearby town of Mokpo. The protest, though initially peaceful, was met with extraordinary and disproportionate violence. Paratroopers and shock troops sent by Chun's command beat students with clubs, dragged them through the streets, and attacked civilians with rifle butts and bayonets. Eyewitnesses later described scenes of indiscriminate brutality. Elderly passers-by assaulted, women stripped and humiliated, teenagers shot or taken away in trucks. The use of such extreme force backfired. It enraged the citizens of Gwangju, who began to rise in solidarity with the students. Bus drivers, shopkeepers, factory workers, and even the clergy joined the uprising. A mass popular resistance formed, and within days the people of Gwangju had seized control of City Hall and several government buildings. In some neighborhoods, citizen militias formed, arming themselves with weapons looted from police stations and barracks. Faced with a full-blown revolt, Chun responded with deadly resolve. He declared the Gwangju uprising a rebellion and ordered it crushed at any cost. On May 21st, paratroopers opened fire on unarmed demonstrators in front of the provincial government building. Tanks rolled into the city, and helicopters circled overhead, raining bullets down on civilian targets. A claim supported by multiple eyewitness accounts, including that of a Catholic priest whose testimony would become central to later investigations. For 9 days, the city was engulfed in chaos, courage, and blood. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Families searched for the missing. The military clamped a media blackout, and much of the country remained unaware of the full scale of the carnage until years later. Estimates of the death toll vary. The official count stands at approximately 200, but many historians and civic groups believe the true number to be far higher, possibly reaching over 1,000. Many of the dead were buried in unmarked graves. Others were never accounted for. The brutality of the suppression shocked the conscience of a nation, and while the Chun regime successfully covered up much of the event at the time, the memory of Gwangju would become a wound in the Korean collective memory that never healed. Chun's critics gave him a name that would haunt him for the rest of his life: the Butcher of Gwangju. Among students and dissidents, his name became synonymous with tyranny and bloodshed. Yet in the months that followed, Chun showed no remorse. He portrayed the uprising as a communist-led insurrection and insisted that his actions had preserved national stability. The international community, particularly the United States, remained largely silent, preoccupied with Cold War politics, and wary of destabilizing a key ally in the region. In the aftermath of the Gwangju massacre, Chun moved rapidly to consolidate what he had gained through blood and fear. The remaining institutions of democratic governance were dismantled or subordinated to military control. The press was censored even more rigorously. Political parties were outlawed. Opposition leaders were either imprisoned or driven underground. The path had been cleared. The Republic of Korea was no longer a fragile post-authoritarian state. It was a military dictatorship, presided over not by a civilian leader, but by General Chun Doo-hwan. In June 1980, Chun officially dissolved the National Assembly. The following month, he created a junta-like body known as the Special Committee for National Security Measures, SCNSM, of which he made himself a member. Though he still lacked a formal presidential title, Chun was now the unrivaled commander of the South Korean state, but he had one more step to take. The rule of generals could not last forever, not even in a land weary of democracy. Chun needed to wrap his regime in the veneer of legitimacy. That opportunity would arrive in August 1980 when he maneuvered to be named president, not through popular vote, but through the manipulation of an electoral college under his control. Gwangju had burned, the nation had been subdued. Now Chun was ready to formalize his dictatorship with the stroke of a pen and the blessings of his newly tamed institutions. Part 5. The Fifth Republic. Dictatorship draped in democracy. By late summer of 1980, Chun Doo-hwan had already amassed near absolute power. Through the calculated dismantling of the old political order and a brutal demonstration of force in Gwangju, he had eliminated any meaningful opposition. The last remnants of democratic institutions, parliament, political parties, and independent press had either been dissolved or brought to heel. The military's grip on a society was total, and Chun, its orchestrator, was now ready to ascend to the presidency. But in a nation that still claimed Republican values, legitimacy required more than control. It demanded a symbolic affirmation, however hollow, of popular consent. On August 27, 1980, the National Conference for Unification, a rubber-stamp electoral body formed under Park Chung Hee to simulate democratic procedures, convened in Jangcheon Arena. Chun was the sole candidate for the presidency. Of the 2,125 delegates present, 2,124 voted in his favor, with one invalid vote cast in an almost laughable gesture of imperfection. It was widely speculated that the single invalid vote had been deliberately allowed to distinguish Chun's rule from that of North Korea's Kim Il-sung, who was infamous for claiming 100% electoral support. On September 1, 1980, Chun Doo-hwan was officially inaugurated as the fifth president of the Republic of Korea. With that act, South Korea entered the era of the Fifth Republic, an era that would be characterized by an uneasy blend of modernization, economic growth, and relentless political repression. In the first months of his rule, Chun set about constructing a legal and institutional framework to support his autocratic authority. One of his earliest moves was the abolition of all existing political parties, including Park Chung Hee's once dominant Democratic Republican Party. This was followed by the implementation of the policy for the merger and abolition of the press, which closed down numerous newspapers and broadcasting stations, consolidating media ownership under state-friendly corporations. In January 1981, Chun founded his own political party, the Democratic Justice Party, DJP. In name, it sounded like a vehicle for pluralism. In reality, it was a rebranding of Park's old authoritarian machine, staffed by military loyalists and bureaucrats under Chun's control. That same month, a new constitution was drafted and ratified, not by popular vote, but through Chun's hand-picked structures. The revised document removed some of the most draconian features of Park's 1972 Yushin Constitution, banning torture, enshrining the secrecy of correspondence, and eliminating legal guilt by association. These changes, while notable, were largely cosmetic. Chun still held vast executive powers, and the single-term limit on the presidency, set at 7 years, was a compromise he accepted only because his control over the DJP allowed him to rule without meaningful challenge. In February 1981, Chun was re-elected by the National Conference for Unification in a sham contest, receiving 90% of the vote against 3 minor candidates. That same month, the DJP won an overwhelming majority in legislative elections, capturing nearly 70% of the seats. The results ensured that Chun would face no resistance from within government, and that his constitutional reforms would never be used to check his authority. Despite the dictatorial nature of his presidency, Chun was acutely aware of international opinion, especially the stance of the United States. Still locked in the Cold War, the U.S. viewed South Korea as a vital bulwark against communism, and Washington had tolerated autocrats in the region before. However, the brutality of the Gwangju uprising and the illegitimacy of Chun's military takeover caused serious discomfort within American diplomatic circles. To placate Washington, Chun issued a missile memorandum in 1980, pledging not to develop missiles with a range greater than 180 kilometers or warheads exceeding 453 kilograms. This concession helped thaw relations and ultimately led to the Reagan administration formally recognizing Chun's government. Chun also worked to distance himself from the legacy of Park Chung Hee. Though he had benefited immensely from Park's patronage, Chun understood that many Koreans viewed Park's rule with resentment. In an unexpected move, Chun expunged references to Park's 1961 coup from official documents and struck his name from portions of the Constitution. He declared that he would pursue justice and national restoration by rooting out the corruption that had plagued Park's regime, an ironic promise, given that Chun's administration would later become one of the most notoriously corrupt in modern Korean history. Domestically, Chun attempted to manufacture consent through public policy initiatives, social reform, and grand gestures. He repealed laws that allowed families to be punished for the crimes of relatives, a relic of earlier authoritarianism, and enacted new criminal statutes, such as the care and custody law, which allowed authorities to detain repeat offenders even after their prison terms. These policies were framed as public safety measures, but also served to expand state control over the population. Yet political repression remained the cornerstone of Chun's rule. Dissidents were arrested, tortured, and surveilled. Intellectuals were censored, opposition parties harassed, and civil society infiltrated. One of the most infamous symbols of this repression was the Samcheong re-education camp, established in August 1980 under the pretense of purifying society. Within 6 months, more than 60,000 individuals were arrested, often without warrants, and forced into brutal labor, indoctrination sessions, and physical abuse. While the regime claimed this was a campaign against crime and vice, it became clear that many of the detainees were simply ordinary citizens caught in dragnet operations or victims of political denunciation. Yet amidst this repression, South Korea continued its remarkable economic rise. Chun's government presided over rapid industrial growth, infrastructure expansion, and export surpluses. In 1986, the country recorded its first ever trade surplus, and preparations were underway to host the 1988 Seoul Olympics. Chun, like Park before him, believed that economic prosperity could compensate for political suppression. He poured state resources into entertainment, professional sports, and mass media, what became known as the 3S policy: sex, screen, and sports. This strategy, borrowed from Japanese counterparts, aimed to distract the public from their political grievances through leisure and consumerism. And yet the pressure continued to build. While Chun could claim control, he could not claim legitimacy. His presidency had been born of a coup, stained by massacre and bolstered by fear. Beneath the surface of South Korea's economic miracle, resentment brewed. Among students, laborers, and the families of Gwangju's dead, the demand for true democracy would not disappear. It waited quietly, like embers beneath ash, ready to erupt when the time came. Part 6. Survival and Stagnation. Assassination, Isolation, and the Limits of Authoritarian Power. Though Chun Doo-hwan had entrenched himself as president and overseer of South Korea's Fifth Republic, the years following his 1981 inauguration were anything but secure. Beneath the surface of authoritarian stability, resistance festered. As political prisoners languished in jails and the press operated under heavy censorship, the South Korean people endured a paradox: unprecedented economic growth under an increasingly suffocating political order. Internationally, Chun sought recognition and legitimacy. Domestically, he governed through a fragile balance of fear, spectacle, and force. The greatest threat to his life came not from South Korea's pro-democracy underground, but from the regime in the north. On October 9, 1983, Chun narrowly escaped assassination in Rangoon, Burma, modern-day Yangon. He had traveled there to pay respects at the Martyrs' Mausoleum, a site honoring Burmese leaders, when a bomb exploded moments before his arrival. The device, planted by North Korean operatives, detonated with devastating effect. 17 members of Chun's entourage were killed, including 4 cabinet ministers and other high-ranking officials. 4 Burmese nationals also died. Chun, who had been delayed on his way to the site, survived the bombing by mere minutes. The Rangoon bombing, one of North Korea's most brazen terrorist acts, shocked the region. South Korea immediately blamed Pyongyang, and international investigations confirmed North Korean involvement. The incident galvanized Chun's regime, allowing it to reinforce its anti-communist rhetoric and justify continued political crackdowns in the name of national security. The attempt on his life also reinforced Chun's belief that his presidency, however undemocratic, was essential for national survival. In response, Chun doubled down on security and surveillance. The KCIA intensified its monitoring of suspected subversives, including student activists, religious leaders, and left-leaning academics. Chun remained convinced that the slightest hint of unrest could be the spark for another Gwangju. His government continued to frame any dissent, however peaceful, as potential communist agitation, a Cold War logic that helped justify sweeping arrests, surveillance, and censorship. At the same time, Chun recognized the need to maintain and expand South Korea's international standing. The 1980s were a time of geopolitical transformation. The Cold War had entered a new phase, and the global economy was becoming increasingly interdependent. Chun's regime needed foreign investment, technological assistance, and most crucially, diplomatic recognition, especially from the United States and Japan. One of Chun's most ambitious efforts was the Korean People's Harmony and Democracy Reunification Program, unveiled in 1982. Framed as a gesture toward inter-Korean reconciliation, the plan called for peaceful reunification through national dialogue and gradual normalization of relations. However, it was met with immediate skepticism. North Korea rejected the plan outright, accusing Chun of using reunification rhetoric as a cover for military consolidation. Few outside observers took it seriously either. Chun's record in Gwangju, combined with his continued persecution of domestic opposition, made his talk of democracy ring hollow. The plan faded into obscurity within months. Nevertheless, Chun worked tirelessly to improve ties with Japan, South Korea's former colonizer, and now its indispensable trading partner. In 1984, he visited Tokyo and secured a $6 billion loan, vital support at a time when the Korean economy was entering a brief period of crisis. At home, foreign loans helped mask growing fiscal imbalances and maintain the illusion of uninterrupted economic ascent. But Chun knew that even with economic expansion, public frustration was mounting. To mollify citizens without conceding political power, his regime leaned heavily on the 3S policy: sex, screen, and sports. Television programming was liberalized to allow more entertainment content. Color television broadcasts were expanded. Censorship of certain films and dramas was relaxed, and suggestive content was quietly permitted to distract the youth from political engagement. Simultaneously, the government launched national professional leagues for baseball and soccer, hoping to cultivate civic pride through sports. Chun also aggressively promoted cultural festivals, including the poorly received Korean Breeze 81, a lavish government-sponsored celebration of traditional arts and heritage. These distractions, however, failed to extinguish the rising tide of political awareness. In universities across the country, student protests grew bolder. Demonstrators no longer just denounced Chun's dictatorship. They demanded constitutional reform, direct elections, and accountability for the Gwangju massacre. Religious leaders, especially progressive elements within the Catholic and Protestant churches, joined the call for democratization. Underground publications circulated testimonies from survivors of Gwangju and critiques of the Samcheong re-education camps. The air was thick with dissent, even as the regime did everything it could to suppress it. Meanwhile, Chun began grooming a successor, not to transition South Korea into democracy, but to ensure continuity of control. He looked first to No Shin-yong, a career diplomat and former ambassador, whom he appointed foreign minister in 1980 and later prime minister in 1985. Chun's intention was clear. No would be his chosen heir, a civilian face to inherit military authority. However, the plan backfired. Chun's military supporters, including members of Hanaho, recoiled at the idea of being replaced by a diplomat with no battlefield credentials. They saw it as a betrayal. Under internal pressure, Chun quietly dropped No as his successor and turned instead to a more acceptable candidate, Ro Tai-woo, his old friend from the 11th class of the Korea Military Academy and a fellow Hanaho member. Ro was loyal, disciplined, and ideologically aligned with Chun. More importantly, he had strong ties to the military establishment. His selection in 1987 as the ruling party's presidential candidate would be one of Chun's last major political acts. But the people of South Korea were no longer willing to accept a succession imposed from above. As the decade wore on, public anger swelled into a national movement. The 1981 Constitution, which Chun had engineered to allow himself a 7-year term with no re-election, was becoming his cage. Unlike Park Chung Hee, Chun could not amend the document to extend his rule. The Constitution specifically prohibited the sitting president from benefiting from amendments. Time was running out. On April 13, 1987, Chun gave a nationally televised speech declaring that there would be no constitutional revision during his term and that his successor would be chosen through indirect election, just as he had been. This defiant statement, known as the April 13th Declaration to Defend the Constitution, was seen by many as a direct slap in the face to the pro-democracy movement. It backfired spectacularly. What followed was a groundswell of nationwide protests, culminating in the June struggle, one of the largest and most sustained pro-democracy movements in Asia's modern history. As demonstrations spread, Chun found himself cornered, no longer the master of events but their prisoner. The streets of South Korea, where fear had once ruled, were now filled with chants for democracy. Part 7. The People Rise. The June struggle and Chun Doo-hwan's reluctant exit. By 1987, the political facade that Chun Doo-hwan had spent nearly a decade constructing began to unravel. The government he had built on force, surveillance, and repression was now under siege, not by a foreign army, but by the indomitable force of his own people. South Koreans, empowered by a growing civil society and years of underground organizing, stood on the brink of a democratic revolution. Chun, once the unquestioned master of the republic, found himself increasingly isolated and embattled. At the heart of this upheaval was Chun's steadfast refusal to allow constitutional reform. The 1981 Constitution, which he had enacted early in his presidency, limited the president to a single 7-year term. As Chun's own term neared its end, pressure mounted for him to amend the document to allow for direct presidential elections, a demand echoed by political opposition parties, student groups, labor unions, and even moderate elements within his own administration. But Chun resisted. On April 13, 1987, in a televised address known as the April 13th Defense of the Constitution speech, he declared that there would be no constitutional revision during his term, reaffirming that his successor would be selected through an indirect electoral process. This meant that South Koreans would again be denied the right to vote directly for their leader, as Chun intended to handpick his successor through the DJP-controlled National Conference for Unification. The announcement triggered a wave of public outrage. What followed was an unprecedented groundswell of civil resistance known as the June Democracy Movement, or the June Struggle. It began in universities where students staged mass sit-ins, demonstrations, and candlelight vigils. From there, the movement spread like wildfire. Catholic and Protestant churches opened their doors to demonstrators. White-collar workers, teachers, and journalists joined in solidarity. Families who had long remained silent about the Gwangju massacre now spoke out openly, sharing their grief and defiance. Even corporate executives, once staunch supporters of authoritarian stability, began to fear the consequences of continued unrest. The tipping point came in late May, when Park Chung Hee, a 21-year-old student activist from Seoul National University, died under torture while in police custody. His death, initially covered up, was revealed to the public by brave journalists and church officials. Park's case became a national symbol of the regime's brutality. Posters of his face and stories of his final words, "Don't kill me," spread across the country. The public, enraged and emboldened, took to the streets in ever larger numbers. Chun, sensing the rising storm, hastily tried to contain the crisis by announcing Roh Tae-woo as his chosen successor on June 10, 1987. But instead of pacifying the country, the announcement poured fuel on the fire. Roh, a fellow general and Chun's old friend from the Korea Military Academy, was seen as a continuation of military rule. Millions viewed the decision as a betrayal of the people's demand for free elections. Demonstrations intensified. The June 10 declaration provoked the largest street protests in South Korean history. An estimated 2 million people took part in demonstrations across the nation. In Seoul, Busan, Daegu, Gwangju, and dozens of other cities, protesters clashed with riot police armed with tear gas, water cannons, and batons. The air filled with smoke, and yet the people did not yield. Citizens from all walks of life participated. Mothers, shopkeepers, students, factory workers, monks. The streets rang with chants, "Down with the dictatorship," and "We demand direct elections." Behind the scenes, even members of Chun's own party and military allies grew nervous. The United States, too, began to press for democratic reform, fearing that prolonged unrest could destabilize one of its most important Cold War allies in Asia. The tide was turning fast. On June 29, 1987, in a stunning political reversal, Roh Tae-woo gave a public address in which he pledged to accept the people's demands: constitutional reform, direct presidential elections, freedom of the press, release of political prisoners, and restoration of civil liberties. Though Chun did not deliver the message himself, it was clear that he had reluctantly capitulated. The military regime had bowed to the will of the people. In July, Chun stepped down as head of the Democratic Justice Party, appointing Roh as his official successor. The revised constitution, drafted that fall, included provisions for free, direct presidential elections, the restoration of habeas corpus, and increased protections for human rights. South Korea was entering a new era. The presidential election of December 16, 1987 was historic. For the first time in decades, citizens could cast a direct vote for their president. Roh Tae-woo won the election with a narrow plurality, largely due to a split in the opposition vote between longtime democracy activists Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam. Despite the disappointment among many progressives, the election itself marked a peaceful constitutional transfer of power, the first in South Korea's modern history. On February 25, 1988, Chun Doo-hwan, who had once risen through the ranks by suppressing democracy, stepped down from office and handed over the presidency to his longtime ally, now elected leader, Roh Tae-woo. Though the transfer was between two former generals, the process was civil, legal, and bloodless. It marked a symbolic end to South Korea's military dictatorship and the beginning of its slow but determined march toward democratic governance. For Chun, the end of his presidency did not mean the end of influence. He retained the honorary chairmanship of the DJP and remained an elder statesman in the eyes of many conservatives. But outside the corridors of power, his name continued to evoke pain, rage, and remembrance. The families of the Gwangju victims did not forget. The students who had fought for democracy remembered the tear gas, the beatings, and the censorship. Chun had exited the presidency without punishment, but history was not finished with him. The post-presidency chapter of Chun's life would see him face public condemnation, legal trials, and a final reckoning with the legacy he had spent decades trying to control. Part 8. Judgment and Defiance. Trials, Convictions, and the Unrepentant Ex-President. Though Chun Doo-hwan stepped down from the presidency in 1988, he left behind a legacy that remained deeply contested. For nearly a decade, he had ruled South Korea through military force, surveillance, and authoritarian control. Now, as the country embarked on its long-awaited path toward democratization, the question loomed: Would the man who had ordered tanks into Gwangju and jailed thousands ever be held accountable? Initially, Chun managed to preserve a degree of dignity in retirement. He retained influence within the ruling Democratic Justice Party, which had evolved into the Democratic Liberal Party, DLP, after a merger with opposition factions. He was named to the National Statesman Committee, a mostly symbolic role, but one that affirmed his status as a senior figure within the establishment. His influence lingered behind the scenes, especially under his successor, Roh Tae-woo, who continued many of Chun's policies and protected him from legal scrutiny. But the tides began to shift in the early 1990s. The 1992 presidential election ushered in a profound change. The opposition candidate Kim Young-sam, a former democracy activist and longtime critic of military rule, was elected as the first civilian president in over 30 years. With Kim's victory came a renewed public demand for justice, particularly regarding the 12/12 military coup of 1979 and the Gwangju massacre of 1980. On November 16, 1995, in response to mounting public pressure and a rapidly changing political atmosphere, President Kim announced the Special Act on the 518 democratization movement, retroactively enabling the prosecution of those responsible for the 1979 and 1980 events. The legislation overturned the statute of limitations and allowed for the reopening of cases against Chun and Roh Tae-woo. Within weeks, Chun and 16 other figures, including senior generals and ministers, were arrested. The charges were sweeping and grave. Chun faced indictments for treason, insurrection, conspiracy, murder, and bribery. The indictment accused him not only of illegally seizing power in 1979, but also of ordering the military crackdown in Gwangju and of embezzling hundreds of billions of won in slush funds accumulated during his presidency. The prosecution presented testimony from former officials, victims, and witnesses, painting a portrait of a man who had used the institutions of state for personal and political gain. In March 1996, Chun's trial began in the Seoul District Court. For months, it transfixed the nation. Televised hearings brought victims' testimonies and official documents into the public eye for the first time. South Koreans, many of whom had lived in fear during Chun's rule, watched as the former general stood in the defendant's box, stone-faced and unapologetic. When asked whether he accepted responsibility for Gwangju, Chun dismissed the charges as politically motivated. He remained defiant, denying personal involvement in the killings and portraying himself as a protector of national stability. But the court saw otherwise. On August 26, 1996, Chun was sentenced to death, an extraordinary ruling against a former head of state. Roh Tae-woo, who was tried alongside him, received a 17-year prison sentence. The charges upheld against Chun included leading an insurrection, murder for the purpose of rebellion, illegal orders to troops, and embezzlement of public funds. It was a landmark moment in Korean history. The state had formally declared that Chun's regime was not only illegitimate, but criminal. Yet the final chapter was still to be written. On April 17, 1997, the Supreme Court of South Korea upheld Chun's conviction, but reduced his sentence to life imprisonment. The court reasoned that although Chun had committed grave crimes, his service to the nation during the Korean War and his role in economic development merited clemency. The ruling was met with mixed emotions: relief that justice had been served, frustration that the sentence had been lessened. Then, in a controversial move, President Kim Young-sam, under the advice of incoming President Kim Dae-jung, himself once condemned to death by Chun's regime, granted pardons to both Chun and Roh in December 1997, just months after the verdict. The decision, framed as a gesture of national reconciliation ahead of the 1998 transition, sparked heated debate. Many saw it as necessary to heal national wounds and move forward. Others, particularly the families of Gwangju's victims, saw it as a betrayal of justice. Although freed from prison, Chun was still required to pay a massive fine of 220 billion, about 200 million, for the illicit funds he had amassed during his presidency. But he continued to defy public expectations. In a press conference following his release, Chun famously claimed, "The declaration provoked widespread outrage and ridicule. Investigators soon uncovered lavish properties, luxury items, and artworks held by Chun and his family. His eldest son, Chun Jae-guk, was discovered to possess hundreds of valuable paintings and antiques stored in secret warehouses. In response, the National Assembly passed what became known as the Chun Doo-hwan Act, extending the statute of limitations for collecting unpaid fines from public officials and permitting seizure of assets from family members if tied to illegal gains. In 2013, a team of nearly 100 prosecutors and investigators raided Chun's residences and family-owned properties, seizing luxury items, paintings by Korean masters, and large sums of hidden assets. Despite these efforts, much of Chun's fine remained unpaid until his death, becoming a symbol of his lifelong defiance. In his later years, Chun attempted to shape his legacy. He began working on a series of memoirs published in 2017, in which he continued to deny wrongdoing and referred to himself as a patriot, dismissing the Gwangju massacre as the result of mob violence. The memoirs provoked new legal action as survivors and civic groups sued him for defamation and spreading falsehoods. One of the most egregious passages involved his attack on Father Cho Chul-hyun, a Catholic priest who had testified about military helicopters firing on civilians during Gwangju. Chun called Cho Satan in a clerical collar. In 2020, Chun was found guilty of defaming the late priest and sentenced to 8 months in prison, suspended for 2 years. During his trial, Chun appeared weak and unwell, sometimes sleeping during proceedings and requiring assistance from his wife, Lee Soon-ja. By 2021, he was reportedly suffering from multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer. Despite the illness, he remained publicly unrepentant. On November 23, 2021, Chun Doo-hwan died at his home in Yeonhui-dong, Seoul. He was 90 years old. His death came less than a month after that of his successor, Roh Tae-woo. In a final twist of fate, the two generals who had ruled South Korea through dictatorship died within weeks of each other. Both unpunished in full, both remembered bitterly by millions. Chun received no state funeral, and the Blue House sent only private condolences. He was ineligible for burial at a national cemetery due to his criminal conviction. According to his widow, Chun had requested a simple funeral and asked that his ashes be scattered in a location overlooking North Korea, a symbolic gesture from a man who had long defined himself as a bulwark against communism. His funeral, held privately by his family, was marked by controversy. His wife issued a vague apology for the pain and wounds caused by her husband's rule, but pointedly omitted any reference to the Gwangju massacre. Civic groups denounced the statement as insincere and inadequate. But perhaps the most unexpected act of reckoning came not from the courts or the state, but from Chun's own bloodline. In March 2023, his grandson, Chun Doo-hwan, took to social media and publicly denounced his grandfather as a slaughterer who had inflicted unimaginable pain on the Korean people. He confessed his own struggles with drug use and called for the Chun family's illegal wealth to be returned to the state. He even traveled to Gwangju, where he wept before victims' families and offered a heartfelt apology on behalf of his lineage. It was a moment that stirred national emotion, a grandson repenting where his grandfather never had, a family's reckoning delivered not by force, but by conscience. Part 9. Legacy of Iron and Ash. Remembering Chun Doo-hwan. The life and rule of Chun Doo-hwan left behind a legacy so complex, painful, and polarizing that South Korea continues to wrestle with its meaning. To some, especially those aligned with authoritarian order and economic pragmatism, Chun was a disciplined soldier who ensured stability during a volatile period. But to millions more, especially survivors of his repression and the generations that followed, Chun's name is etched into memory as a symbol of brutality, injustice, and the stubborn refusal of truth. His rise to power, engineered through a military coup, solidified by manipulation of intelligence services, and ultimately baptized in the blood of the Gwangju massacre, marked one of the darkest chapters in modern Korean history. Chun's regime was defined not only by its authoritarianism, but by its ruthless efficiency. He understood how to seize control, consolidate it, and then mask it behind the veneer of bureaucratic legality. The republic he ruled, his fifth republic, was democratic in form but dictatorial in essence. The Gwangju uprising remains the most damning indictment of his rule. Though he refused to accept responsibility until the end of his life, the massacre is now commemorated annually and recognized as a turning point in the nation's march toward democracy. For the families of the victims and the citizens of Gwangju, Chun's unapologetic stance only deepened their pain. Every unreturned medal, every denied testimony, and every evasive answer in court was a reminder that justice, though pursued, was never truly achieved. Chun's economic policies, however, complicate the narrative. Under his administration, South Korea achieved its first-ever trade surplus in 1986, maintained high GDP growth, and laid infrastructure crucial to the country's transformation into an industrial power. His regime's investment in media, sports, and entertainment, though partly intended to distract the public, had long-term cultural effects that shaped modern South Korean identity. Yet even here, his legacy is shaded. Much of the economic success owed more to the momentum of the preceding Park Chung Hee years and to the labor of a silenced population than to visionary governance. Prosperity under repression, many argue, is no true prosperity at all. In the years following Chun's exit from power, South Korean civil society flourished. The nation transitioned into a robust, participatory democracy with successive, peaceful transfers of power. The memory of dictatorship remained fresh in the public mind and galvanized reforms aimed at curbing presidential overreach. Education about the Gwangju uprising became part of the school curriculum. Museums and memorials were built. Survivor testimonies were preserved and honored. In these efforts, South Korea began to heal. And yet Chun's post-presidency behavior remained a national affront. His infamous claim, "I have only to do 90,000 to my name," became a dark punchline, emblematic of elite impunity. His defiant memoirs, his courtroom denials, and his family's slow repayment of embezzled funds all served to deepen public resentment. His funeral, notably denied state honors, reflected the unresolved place he held in the national psyche. Even in death, Chun divided the country. Perhaps the most powerful reckoning came through his grandson, Chun Doo-hwan, whose dramatic public apology in 2023 touched a chord throughout the nation. By visiting the Gwangju cemetery, weeping before the families of the dead, and calling his grandfather though some viewed his gesture as performative or insufficient, others saw in it a glimmer of long-denied reconciliation. What then is Chun Doo-hwan's place in history? He was, without doubt, one of South Korea's most consequential figures. His actions shaped the nation's institutions, its political culture, and the very boundaries of its democracy. His regime inspired both fear and resistance. He demonstrated the dangers of unchecked military power and the cost of silencing dissent. Yet, ironically, by pushing repression to its limits, he also inadvertently gave rise to Korea's most determined democratization movement, the June struggle, that ultimately broke his grip on power and ushered in a new era. Chun's legacy serves as a cautionary tale. It reminds Koreans and the world that the path to freedom is often paved with sacrifice, that prosperity without justice is hollow, and that no fortress of power, no matter how fortified, can withstand the steady pressure of a people determined to be free. In stone and statue, Chun left little to commemorate himself. He requested no tomb, no shrine, no monument. His ashes were scattered in anonymity, overlooking North Korea, a final gesture from a man who saw himself as a soldier, even when the war was long over. But the history he helped write remains engraved not in marble, but in the hearts of those who survived him. A dictator, a soldier, a symbol, a warning. That is the legacy of Chun Doo-hwan.